Hello. My name's Craig Hutton. I'm here at the University of Southampton at the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences. I'm a professor of sustainability science, which is a relatively new field, and I'm hoping by the end of my career, I'll know exactly what it is I do as my career. But mostly it centers around how are we organizing the world in terms of its social context, its economic context, and I suppose mostly I'm interested in the environmental context. But how do they all fit together, and how are we going to manage this process? Climate change, sustainability. My particular research interests center in the developing world. So by that I mean we work in coastal Vietnam, do a lot of work in South Asia, particularly Bangladesh, which in a climate change context is well understood to be one of the key areas of impact. And I'm particularly interested in the rural areas. How do people who live in those rural, often very poor environments, how does changes in the environment, some of which are climate change, some of which aren't, how does that impact on those people's lives? And how do we deal with the complex sort of nexus of policy, the environment, and people's behavior and livelihoods? And that involves a lot of modeling and conceptualization in order to do something practical for policymakers. That's a real underpinning of the kind of work that me and my colleagues, and I work with many people, do in this environment. So how is it that we engage with policymakers? What are the real practical approaches? Well, there are, of course, many of them, but in my experience, and I mainly work in international development, actually the first thing you have to do is really get to know some individuals. Now, that's actually quite a difficult thing in some ways, and it may not be the first thing that everyone thinks of, but if you want to work with government and government agencies in much of the world, and particularly in the developing world, you often have to get to know specific individuals because it's a very hierarchical system. And the person at the top often has extraordinary influence and power. And people below that level are going to be a little bit nervous with engaging you without permission. That isn't always the case. Perhaps here in the UK, there's perhaps a little more subsidiarity where authority is sort of farmed out. But our experience has been that you learn who is really in control of the area you're interested in, which ministries and which individuals, and you engage with them. You make a strong effort. So a really good example of my own or our own experience in Bangladesh and India was when an opportunity came up to help contribute to a written document, which was called the Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100. Now, that document was already underway, it was being written, it was being constructed, and it's the plan for how the coastal zone of Bangladesh is going to be managed up to 2100. And because of the work we'd done, specifically the work around poverty, we were able then to change the wording in that document. Actually, some of the outputs we were generating were able to modify the approach that was being advised in this policy document. And perhaps more interesting than that has been, in recent years, we've re-engaged with some of these policymakers and academics in new projects and adjunct projects that have come from the main project. And one of the most satisfying components of that is seeing those people reflecting back at, in their engagement, some of the things you built with them. And I've seen that happening a lot. The language we use, the idea of using systems, in my case, systems models. I've been in meetings where I've seen people we've worked before say, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. And I have a sense that, we partner with them in developing that approach. So there's the practical output that you want to change policy, you want to change the way the country governs to some extent. You're trying to put information in for them to make those decisions. But there's also the longer term, the change in their paradigm, their way of thinking, the way they adopt approaches which we jointly developed. And that perhaps has an even longer influence on how policymakers think. Perhaps less tangible, but nonetheless probably just as effective. So a very valid question that I and my colleagues are often asked is, what's the policy implications of your research? Where do they actually touch the ground? What's the value of them? And because we tend to design our research around what we know to be policy interests, we talk with policymakers, I think we can often answer that question quite well. In the research I and my colleagues are involved in, perhaps the simplest way of putting it is we often try to design simulations. If you've played SimCity or some sort of computer game like that, what we try to do is build models of complex systems like deltas that have a social component, economic component, environmental context, lots of things going on in there. So we need scientists from all corners to come and work with us. We try to build these systems, and then we try to test policies. So the policymakers will say to us, well, what would happen on this delta if we built a huge wall here, defensive wall? Would it work? How much would it potentially mitigate against flooding? Or what would happen if instead of that, we invested in huge scale, what's called nature-based solutions of mangroves, say. So what we're trying to do is build a platform from which policymakers can explore ideas. Now, that has certain benefits. It allows you to test in a safe space, within reason. It's only a model, but we can play it out with different scenarios of the future, and we see multiple outcomes. But it also allows policymakers to think in different ways. If you really are implementing a policy, you tend to be place safe. You go with what you've known before. Call these the policy levers, and you'll have one or two of them. And if you get it wrong, it's pretty bad. So if you create an environment where you can say, well, I see what they're doing in Vietnam, another delta we work on, the Mekong Delta. I see what they're doing. What would happen if we applied that here? Oh, it doesn't work. Oh, actually, that worked a lot better than we think. What if we combine these things? So for us, because we design our research to answer questions we know policymakers want answers to, in the first place, the tools we produce can be interacted with by policymakers. And recently we did this with the Bangladeshi government, where they wanted to test 3 different approaches to how to invest billions of dollars on coastal Bangladesh. And where would they build a wall? Would they build things called polders, circular embankments for protecting rice? Or would they build large mangroves, or combinations of them? And a really good example is, very clearly our model showed that the circular embankments were by far and away the best solution. But by building these circular embankments, these large areas protected from the sea and floods, it displaced the floods to a very poor region, which nobody thought of, us, ourselves included. The model kind of pointed it out to us. And that was something we could give to the policymakers, that if you do this, this is your best solution. But did you also know that one of the consequences which matters to you as a policymaker is that flooding would occur somewhere else, and you're going to need to mitigate against that? I think it's a really good example where their input, their questions, our design with them, co-design, and then the utilization of it made it relevant and gave us all new information, which is of direct relevance to those policymakers. And that, was probably one of the clearest examples, certainly in my career, of this whole cycle, right from the beginning of the project, having a benefit right at the end of the project. I think that's probably the best example I have. So in my policy travels, I've had a lot of support from Public Policy Southampton, PPS. Early on, some years ago, in fact, we were looking for contacts in DFID, which sadly no longer exists, but Department for International Development. And PPS helped us with some linkages, with contacts and engagements, and that was very useful. So there's a sort of fairly simple, practical pathways in. And that's something that PPS has done for us and continues to do for many people, which is why I think it's pretty fundamental for a university to have an organisation like PPS. Additional to that, there were some workshops that PPS have run. I've been engaged in a couple of workshops where I've been invited to talk, and they've been very useful in terms of networking, because the value of networking really is you'll turn up to talk to one group of people because you've got something in mind, and you'll meet someone from an organisation or a department you hadn't even thought of would be interested in your work. And this is part of networking. And I think PPS has networking at its heart. And we can do some of that, but having a team who are dedicated to that is self-evidently useful to us. Particularly when we're taking the work that we've done overseas and we want to engage it here and show its value in the UK. And I think that that's extraordinarily valuable. So, of course, we have this fantastic opportunity coming up in the UK in the form of COP26. Conference of Parties is what that stands for. And it's the 26th Conference of Parties and can be held in Glasgow in November. And this is a huge opportunity globally, but of course in the UK, to show how our science around climate change and its impacts and the potential for adaptation interfaces with policy. And we're doing a lot of work. I'm working with UNICEF on that at the moment, looking at a climate change child risk index, a global index. I'm working with the British Council, looking at Southeast Asia, what do we need to do to understand risk from climate change. I'm leading on those two. But this is also going to be a fantastic opportunity for PPS to work within the university to look at our strategy, a kind of Southampton at COP type approach, which I think will emerge because so many of us are working on the COP relationships and policy. And definitely PPS has specifically worked with me in terms of invitations to meetings, in developing policy briefs, in guiding guiding us through the sort of maze of policy activities that occur in the UK. And so I'm literally yesterday was spending some time with PPS members working some of these features out. So I'm very grateful that there's a guide for the UK side of this, because I don't have time to do that. But having this group together is, invaluable for me. So, as with many academics and researchers, particularly nowadays, our research really has to resonate with policymakers here in the UK or internationally. So you can imagine in certain elements of academia, that may not be true. It's blue skies research. You're doing stuff that might be technologically related, and somebody else can deal with how you apply it. But the kind of research we do really only makes sense if it in some way assists policymakers. So it's this interesting interface between science, and it is sustainability science. We use the scientific method, but also that pragmatism. How could we use this? We need to be able to adjust what we do to make sure it's useful to people. And that isn't a difficult interface. For some people, they're saying, well, are you truly scientists? And other people are saying, well, this is taxpayers' money and it needs to have some benefit. And I don't think many people would argue that there is today a real need for all scientists who can to really get their hands to the pump on how we deal with some of the sustainability and climate issues. There are many ways we might wish to interact with policymakers, but I have three sorts of rules when we're starting our projects. The first is talk to policymakers before you design the finalized approach. Find out what is their day job. What is it that they need you to do? There is really no value turning up and saying, hey, I've got this fantastic idea, but it completely opposes everything you've been doing before. Because that won't make you any friends. It's just the reality. And it's what we used to do. Just turn up. It's called become a solution that goes looking for a problem. Well, first we need to understand the problem and then design our solutions. Sort of common sense, but it's taken a long time for us to really absorb that. The second thing is to make sure your policymakers are actively engaged in the science you're doing. They may contribute. They genuinely can contribute. Remember, they're experts. They have a lot of knowledge. So we spend a lot of time with our policymakers taking knowledge from them, utilizing it, valuing that knowledge, and that means a lot, and allowing them to help design the models and approaches and using their input. That also makes them more interested in the outcome, of course. And finally, you've got to follow up. You can't just turn up with your model or your suggestions, say, here they are, bye. And that does happen sometimes because we spend 3 years modeling and we have a week to hand it over. You know, what we must do, and I think this affects how we get funded, we must spend time working with our policymakers, understanding their problems, thinking of solutions that are relevant to what they need, and then maybe there can be some funding at the end, some time at the end to make sure you look at the implementation of that information. You're around to help, you're around to be there. I mean, in a very simple way, that are 3 things I would start people off when people do come and say, how do I engage with policymakers? Obviously, it's more complex than that, but those 3 are a strong underpinning.